The worthless cowboy with hands too big for fine tools and a heart too soft for a world that chewed up people like him. Until one woman, rich, elegant, grieving, saw through the dirt and silence and offered him more than work. She offered him dignity. What happened next wasn't a love story. It was something harder, deeper, and far more unforgettable. Before you scroll past, ask yourself, how often do we misjudge those who don't know how to speak for themselves? Stay. Watch. And maybe you'll start seeing people differently too. The dawn's first light crept gently over the spines of the Texas mesquite, painting dusty rays across the board-strewn floor of an old horse trailer where he lay curled like a ghost of a man nobody wanted, big, towering, strong, and yet smaller than a whisper in the world that refused to see him as anything but a burden. And in that silence lay the weight of every cruel laugh, every cruel nickname, every dismissive wave, every turning back of a face as he passed by on the roadside or shuffled past in the diner's door, backpack sagging and hope sagging with it, his name, his face, his very existence erased by the town that valued dollars over dignity and strength over soul, but who cared to measure the miles of sorrow hidden in calloused hands or the dreams buried in the folds of waning hope. He rose that morning not with the authority of a hero, but with the quiet resignation of a man accustomed to waking up in places forgotten. This trailer, parked at the edge of a rancher's land he didn't own, gave him a place to breathe, to exist, though the world insisted he was worthless. And maybe that town was right, he thought often, brushing dust off his boots as though the earth itself whispered reminders. You don't belong. But that morning, as he stepped outside, the wind wrapped around him like a lover's hand, warm, forgiving, encouraging, and he dared to push his shoulders back just a fraction, as if to tell himself, it's not always this way. The world may not see you, but you still stand. And so he performed a ritual that had become as much about survival as it was about routine. He slid open the trailer door, kicked off his boots, their tattered leather soaked with the dried residue of yesterday's work, and he stared at the horizon, letting the sun's early blaze light the scars on his arms, invisible to the world but etched deep into his own heart, each one a memory of being told he was slow, of being handed chores that paid nothing and earned laughter, of being shoved from the schoolyard for being too big and too quiet, and of being left behind by the few who tried but could not save him from himself. He closed his eyes, inhaled the scent of pine sap and sagebrush and the faint fragrance of freedom that rides on wind, and for a moment, just a single luminous, sacred moment, he allowed himself to believe that today might not end the same. It could be different, and that small possibility bloomed inside him like a stubborn flower in cracked concrete. He pulled on his boots again, mud-caked, scuffed, stained, and each step he took as he walked toward the fence line wasn't just for the land that needed mending. It was for the boy who once crawled across broken boards to peer into windowless barns, hoping for something, anything that hinted at worth. He walked through tall grasses bending with dew, and as he worked, hammering posts, tightening wires, fixing what had been left to rot, he felt the rhythm of routine heal something in him that words never could. Each nail he drove was an unspoken plea. Each board he straightened was a step removed from the shame that had clung to his soul. And then she appeared on the horizon, not in a flash of glamour, but quietly, her silhouette framed by the rising sun, her posture elegant though unmistakably out of place among the rough-hewn fences and dusty boots. She stepped into his world softly, almost afraid, but there was a fire in her eyes, a fire that said she didn't look at him and see worthless. She saw muddy boots that carried him home, hands that could build, and a heart that had beaten through years of silence. Still strong. He flinched at first, because he did not expect to be seen. He had trained himself not to expect recognition, to live in the margins, beneath notice. But something in the way she watched him, without pity, without surprise, shook loose something invisible. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was neither high nor soft. It bore the weight of someone who'd lost and learned, someone who'd had enough of everything and wanted something more. And when she said simply, "I need your help," it echoed between them, not as charity, but as invitation. And in that moment, he felt the prison of invisibility crack, just enough that a single beam of light could slip in. So he nodded, too stunned to speak, and began to walk toward her and toward something new. And though he didn't know it yet, that single nod would be the fracture line between who he had been and who he might become, and from that break would come a reckoning of worth, built not from gold or praise, but from the quiet certainty that even the broken, the dismissed, the forgotten, especially them, can become the ones who hold the world together. One nail, one heartbeat, one trembling step at a time. She had watched him work for nearly a full hour before she spoke again, not out of hesitation but reverence, because there was something almost sacred in the way he moved, like a man who understood the land in a way machines never could, his strength not loud or showy but slow, precise, and unbending, the kind of strength that never needed to announce itself because it had long ago proven its worth to winds, winters, and wounds that would have broken lesser men. And though she stood there, a woman born into polished floors and legacy estates, her boots still too new, her clothes crisp whereas were sun-faded and stitched with memory, she did not feel taller than him. In fact, as she watched the sweat bead along his brow and fall without drama to the earth beneath his hands, she felt smaller, more fragile, not out of weakness, but because she was witnessing something rare, a man who had suffered and not become cruel, who had been silenced but never learned to lie, whose presence unsettled others only because it reminded them of how little they truly knew about resilience. He looked up at her finally, not with defiance, but with something quieter, almost curious, as if trying to decide whether she would speak to him like all the others had, in clipped instructions or saccharine pity. And she felt the air between them thicken with all the things he'd likely never say. The distrust earned from 1,000 rejections, the armor built from humiliation disguised as hard labor, and the question he was too proud to ask, "Why are you still standing there?" But instead of retreating, she stepped closer, offering him a mason jar of cold water, and when he reached for it, their fingers didn't quite touch, but the space between them vibrated with something unspoken, something that felt less like possibility and more like history being gently rewritten. "You fix things," she said simply, and he blinked, unsure whether it was a question or a statement. So she added, "My father's place needs someone who doesn't just swing hammers, but someone who listens to what's broken before trying to make it right." He didn't respond, just took a long drink, the kind you take when you don't trust your voice to stay steady. And when he handed the jar back, his fingers trembled just a little, not from exhaustion, but because she hadn't looked away, hadn't flinched, hadn't talked down. That night, as he returned to his trailer, he lay awake staring at the roof that leaked whenever it rained, the stars barely visible through the patched skylight above, and he thought not about her beauty or her money. He'd been around both and trusted neither, but about the way her words had landed, not as orders but as invitations, soft and wide enough for someone like him to consider stepping into. The next morning, when he arrived at the old ranch house, it was barely light, and she was already waiting with rolled-up sleeves, a toolbox in one hand and a folded blueprint in the other. But when she saw him, she smiled, not the kind of smile people gave out of politeness, but the kind that said, "I see you, and I'm glad you came back," and something in his chest, long dormant, stirred in response, not love, not yet, but the faintest echo of trust beginning to wake. The days that followed moved slowly, rhythmically, like songs without lyrics. The creak of old wood being torn down, the clink of new nails driven in with care, and in between, the silences that should have felt awkward but didn't, because she never pushed him to speak, never demanded backstory or credentials, and he, in turn, found himself wanting to offer pieces of himself anyway. A comment here, a story fragment there, until one afternoon, under the porch frame he'd rebuilt by hand, he told her about the time he broke his collarbone falling from a tractor and said it himself because no one came to help, and she didn't gasp or pity him, just nodded, like it made perfect sense that he'd learned to be his own rescue. She told him about her father, not the public version of him, all charm and investments, but the man she knew behind closed doors, who raised her with rules, but loved her with awkward tenderness, who trusted the land more than bankers and whose death, years ago, had felt less like loss and more like betrayal, because he left without warning, without letters, without fixing the mess he'd made of their finances, their name, or her heart. And so here they were, two people building something neither fully understood, yet both somehow needed, and though they rarely touched, rarely stood close enough to feel each other's breath. Their connection grew like the roots of prairie grass, invisible but deep, stubborn but soft, growing stronger with every unspoken act of care. And when she brought him lunch one day, not store-bought, not fancy, just a simple sandwich wrapped in wax paper, he paused before eating, staring at it like it was something sacred, and she realized he wasn't hungry for food as much as he was starved for kindness. That night, he stayed later than usual, fixing a gate hinge that wasn't urgent but had been bothering her since childhood, and as she watched him under the porch light, her arms crossed to keep herself steady, she whispered without knowing why, "They always said I needed saving." And he, without looking up, replied, "They say a lot of things about people they don't understand." And in that moment, the air around them shifted, not romantic, not yet, but redemptive, like two wounds recognizing each other and deciding not to bleed alone anymore. And from that day forward, they worked not just on the ranch, but on something bigger, quieter, and far more difficult, the rebuilding of two lives that had been written off by everyone else, and perhaps even by themselves. He started arriving earlier now, not because she asked, but because something in him pulled him toward the place like it was a memory he hadn't lived yet, something unfinished, calling his hands to work before the sun even peeked above the cottonwood trees. And as he moved across the old soil of her father's land, he began to feel a strange familiarity in its creaks and groans, as if the dirt itself remembered him, or more hauntingly, had been waiting for him all this time, whispering stories through the wind that didn't speak in words but in textures, in quiet resistance, in the way cracked earth clung to his boots like it knew where he'd been. And when she came out holding coffee in chipped porcelain, hair undone and eyes soft from sleep, she no longer saw a worker. She saw someone whose silence healed her in ways comfort never had, someone who wasn't there to fix things for her, but beside her, and that difference changed everything. The ranch began transforming, not quickly, not with blueprints and backhoes, but with the steady grace of two people who understood how to rebuild from grief, who knew how to hold brokenness without running from it. And so every fence post planted wasn't just structural, it was symbolic. Every repaired shutter a quiet statement that nothing, not even things long left to rot, were beyond saving, and their routines fell into rhythm like breath. She'd open the old barn doors just as he finished sweeping the porch. He'd have nails lined up before she handed him the hammer, and though few words passed between them, something real, something rooted, grew in the spaces where language usually lived. She began leaving notes, small ones, tucked between wood piles or taped to thermoses, never dramatic, never demanding, just little windows into her world. "My father used to sit here with his dog and smoke before dawn," or "This swing was where I told him I wanted to leave for college." And slowly, quietly, these notes told the story of a woman unraveling her past, not through tears, but through trust, offering it piece by piece to a man who didn't speak much, but listened deeply. And sometimes that listening looked